you can you see just the presentation? Because I have your faces here and the participant list. You can't see that, right?
I can, yeah, I think you're live. I can see your screen and the participant list is floating. You might just have to click on your screen when we're ready to go.
Okay.
To put it in the foreground.
Is that clean now? The window, is it clean? Or?
Yep.
I can, okay.
All right, so let's get started. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Matt Hipsey. Thanks for joining in on our our Thursday afternoon seminar today. I'd like to welcome Juan Castillo-Rowe. He's joining us this afternoon from New South Wales. And we're very grateful he has made himself available to present this afternoon's seminar. So Juan received his PhD from UNSW and has worked as a research scientist and groundwater modeler with CSIRO. He's also worked for 6 years in the Atacama Desert for the Chilean Water Authority and also for water utilities and as a water engineering consultant. He now works at UTS and works on transdisciplinary systems modeling, working at the interface between water resource management, stakeholder engagement, and computational social science. So his work aims to enhance the ability of stakeholders to identify solutions to complex socio-hydrologic issues. And he's published extensively on these novel approaches on how to simulate the interaction of humans with regard to water management. So very much looking forward to Juan's presentation this afternoon. And if you have any questions, you can just keep them in the chat while Juan's talking and we'll be happy to go through them all at the end. So with that, Juan, I'm gonna hand over to you. So I think your screen's already sharing. So the floor is yours.
Okay, Matt, thank you very much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to communicate with in Western Australia. I remember my time very fondly, time I spent there, so thanks for the invitation. So this talk is a bit about bringing together the thinking and the experiences that I've been collecting for a number of years. Just a bit of a background, as Matt was saying, I'm a water engineer by training. I spent most of my early days in Chile in the north, in the Atacama Desert, working for government agencies and water utilities. Of course, over there, water is a big issue. And I migrated to Australia 2010 and spent some time at UNSW. I went to Western Australia, worked for CSIRO for 2 years, came back to the East Coast to Wollongong UTS. And most of the stuff I'm gonna mention today, the ideas come from some training I did in complex systems modeling and agent-based modeling in the US and France. And basically the areas that I work on are the ones that are there up in the center: socio-hydrology, hydroinformatics, participatory modeling, and something that I call management flight simulators. We'll speak a bit about all these things in a second. The starting point for me is this book I came across, and this idea of the wisdom of the crowds that I came across early on in my, when I decided to come back to academia. And probably you've come across this book in one way or another, or the concept of the wisdom of the crowd. And there's a little story there about a submarine that gets lost in the middle of the Atlantic, and nobody really knows where it is. And a person that was in charge of finding this submarine, he created a really smart way of solving a problem, a complex problem. So what he did is he created a process that had 4 ingredients. that are the ingredients that usually bring out this wisdom of the crowd. And this is something that really struck me, and I've been striving to embed these ingredients in environmental modeling and groundwater management more broadly. And the 4 ingredients are diversity. So it means not just engaging the experts, but it starts from the basis that everybody's an expert. So try to encourage diversity in some way. And again, treat that everybody has a piece of the puzzle, right? The 3rd ingredient is have some sort of independence in the process. So everybody can voice their opinions or share their expertise in a more or less independent way. And there is some form or systematic form of aggregating those opinions. And as the previous slide was showing, when you sort of tick those 4 boxes, you can create processes that are pretty close to the answer. In this case, the estimate that these people came up with this process was 70 meters from the actual location of the submarine. So the question I asked you today, or just to reflect on, is when we approach environmental management or water resource management issues, do we really see these ingredients? So usually what happens, we have a mess or a wicked problem, and we have some stakeholders that raise some needs, some concerns. They approach us, maybe consultants or scientists, and we sit down in our cubicles and we build some models. We write some reports, presentations that are full of statistics that not many people understand. And that triggers either a policy, a regulation, an investment, or intervention. So if you think about it, we're not really touching on or we don't have all those 4 ingredients to harness the wisdom of the crowd. So think about a drought. It's, I see it as a balancing act. So you have usually on one end, typical things, economy, growth versus environment. In the middle, you have things that are kind of make the conversation quite difficult. There are things that are difficult to quantify, but they are really important in maintaining that balance. We have regulation. So we have some capacity to tilt the system, but everything is hinging on something that is uncertain. We're not really sure. We don't have much control over. So when you look at issues like the ones in the Murray-Darling Basin and other systems around Australia, it kind of fits this. So we're dealing, as we all know, we're dealing with complex socio-environmental systems. There are multiple perspectives, beliefs, values, things operating at different scales, no single solution. And the problem is when you poke these systems, when you try to intervene them, they can go in a number of directions. And usually they might be not the intended one. So the question, and what I'll try to answer in this presentation, at least is from the collection of experiences I've had, things I've seen working for government, industry, academia, sitting different sides of the table, what I think is a framework that can help us in not dropping the ball. So in other words, how do we find our submarines? So the starting point for me is this iceberg analogy that comes from systems thinking. And it's this idea that 10% of the ice is above the water, 90% is below the water. If you really want to manage this problem or this iceberg, we need to look underneath the surface. And if we really want to transform these systems, so we have a catchment or a system that needs to be managed more sustainably, if we really want to change things, we need to go very deep and something that's called mental models. So I would argue that that's the root cause of most of the problems we see in water management are due to people's beliefs, values, identities, assumptions, etc. Everything above that is important, but if you really want to transform the system and manage it properly, you need to think of the mental models that are at play. So I don't want to go very deep into this, but when we're looking at a water resource problem or any problem, you have people, stakeholders we all have cognitive limitations, and we build these mental models of how the world works, how these systems works, and we can only encode so much of the problem. So we make simplifications, and our models end up being biased in one way or another. And the number of biases that you can fall into are huge. This is a thing called the Cognitive Bias Codex. It says 188. The last time I saw it, it was above 200. So all sorts of biases you can sort of carry without knowing. That's not something, I don't think that's something bad, because we have biases. They're good and bad in some way, but going back to the ingredients that contribute to leveraging this wisdom of the crowd, these biases bring diversity, sort of this local knowledge, and some sort of independence in our opinions. So this is all, I'm going backwards a little bit. I'm going to show you the framework I've developed to sort of harness these ingredients. And it starts by taking your issue and you put it literally on the table, and you have some structured, systematic way to elicit people's mental models of the situation. You organize some workshops with them, and what we've been doing is eliciting their mental models using a technique called fuzzy cognitive mapping. It has a horrible name. It's nothing more, nothing less than boxes with concepts connected with arrows. So you have your cause-effect relationships. You have this way of aggregating individual mental models to an aggregate. So you can build like a shared group mental model, and I'll show you how we do that in a second. Then you can take it a step further and use those mental models to build some sort of social simulation that captures the behaviors and the key drivers, social drivers of the system. And only then I think we should be bringing in our traditional biophysical models, and we can connect them to these simulations. And then you can go take this in two ways. One is more the stakeholder engagement way, where you have this sort of sophisticated piece of software and you build a friendly user-friendly interface around it, and to build something like a flight simulator. So what I mean by that is you sit people on a cockpit, and they can change parameters in these simulations and models, so they can increase rainfall, increase pumping, change crops that farmers are growing, etc. And they can see the outputs on the fly, right? And you can like do this in a workshop, have an actual transparent conversation of the possible impacts of different decisions. Another way you can take this is if in some cases, I've worked with some agencies that are not very comfortable with it, the management flight simulator way. So then you do a more empirical, like numerical exercise using something called robust decision making. I'll explain what that is towards the end of the presentation. But it's this idea of being very humble, that the future is uncertain, and we can't run models the traditional way. So run 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 scenarios, and then make a decision. A robust decision making, what you do is you run the model millions of times, and you go backwards from that, and you see which policies are robust to any possible future that could unfold. So that's the framework that I'm promoting, and I've been using in a number of projects. I'll mention them further in the presentation. So there's like 5 work packages here. I'll focus on the mental model elicitation. I'll give you some examples on the agent-based modeling. I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example also of the management flight simulators I built in Chile. And I'll just mention in passing the integration with environmental models and the robust decision-making part. just so you have an idea of how these things fit together. So I think the glue that brings everything together is this idea of participatory modeling, and it's that first ingredient of the wisdom of the crowd, where everybody's an expert, no matter who that person is. It could be a farmer, an academic, a consultant, a government officer. Everybody's an expert. That's, to me, what participatory modeling is. That there's people that hold objective knowledge, numbers, statistics, the other people that farmers hold tacit knowledge, this knowledge of how hydrological system work, that we also need to incorporate. This idea of co-constructing something, building something together, and therefore people own it. And this is nothing more and nothing less than what Ikea does with us when we go and buy furniture with them. They make us build these things, and we tend to get attached to them. It's not the best furniture, but because we build it, we kind of pull them apart, pull them together again. So we're using the same psychological trick. We build these scientific models with people, so they own them and they believe them. The other thing we're doing here is stretching these sort of areas of, or this pathway we usually kind of bias towards the public sector and the experts, where we do all the hard work and then we communicate only at the very end with our stakeholders. With these techniques I'm presenting today, you can you become a facilitator. You're just leading the process, but it's a more engaged and open way to build scientific. The participatory modeling toolkit, it's made up of a number of techniques. You can follow a number of paths. It's very flexible. So you can tailor it to any problem. So it's just a matter of having this understanding of what the toolkit is and how you can connect the different tools. So that's in red are some of the ones that we've been most commonly using for water management and the framework that I've described. This is the part I kind of enjoy most, and it's the mental model elicitation. And usually you would get together, like pre-COVID, you would get together with your stakeholders and build these fuzzy cognitive maps that are concepts connected with arrows, some sort of weight associated to the relationship, and that's it. So nothing special. But these fuzzy cognitive maps are really interesting because you can, behind the scenes, they're based on network science and network theory. So you can activate concepts. So for example, concept A could be a policy, and you activate that policy, and numerically that activation propagates through the network. And you can see the impact of policy A on outcome D. D could be something that your stakeholders are worried about. And of course, this is a simple example, but if you'll see that these networks can get very ugly. So even if you do this kind of exercise, you can run scenarios on them. So it's not just, it's like there's semi-qualitative, sort of in between qualitative and quantitative. And you can create and use these maps using a software called Mental Modeler that is free and open source. Here's an example of how these fuzzy cognitive maps look for a water management case study. You can group your concepts in categories or areas. There you have the weights of the relationships in different colors. And for stakeholders, if you do this in certain ways, it can be a very engaging exercise. They get very messy. Here's another example. And on the bottom left, it's an example of this activation process. So the modeler here is activated, for example, soil and water conservation techniques, propagated that activation to all the other nodes, and you can see the impact, sort of notionally, the impact that activation would have on different outputs. Just a parenthesis here, we were about to do this work in Chile, in the Atacama Desert, on a project that it's really interesting. It's a beautiful part of the world. You have these flamingos that you would think find in a tropical place, just drinking water and migrating here in the Andes. And interestingly, this system, in this particular system, the northern Atacama Desert, that's where our efforts to decarbonize the economy lie on. And I don't know if you read about this situation, but in these this brines here in these lakes, they're very salty lakes that contain high concentrations of lithium. So in this particular basin, the Salar de Atacama, this estimation is 30-40% of the world's lithium in a form that it's very easy to extract. I'll show that in a second. So it's an interesting telecoupling situation here where our efforts to combat climate change. So it's thought that, or it's estimated that by decarbonizing transport systems, you could reduce CO2 emissions by about 15 to 60%. You need lithium power those cars, those Teslas. And most of that lithium will come from this. So here is a satellite photo of the Salar de Atacama, and you see these really interesting, huge structures that are nothing more, nothing less than huge evaporation ponds. So they take water from the brines in the area. Here's an example of one of the mining companies doing that. And it's so cheap to take the lithium in this way. You just put it in a pond and the sunlight just takes the water out, it concentrates. I believe it's 10 times cheaper than extracting it from rock. And this is one of the only places that you find lithium like this. And I was saying before, the lithium demand for transport, it's close to being the largest demand of lithium globally. And the problem is here, there's indigenous communities that, here's a photo of a villager is standing on a local community water tank, empty. These guys are not opposed to the development, but they believe it has to be done in a sustainable way. There's been social unrest. There's concerns about the flamingos that are protected species. There's some Ramsar wetlands up here. And there's Aboriginal values attached to these systems. A small change in salinity in these brines can destroy the whole ecosystem. They're very sensitive. So we were about to do the workshops, the mental model elicitation with government agencies in Chile. And about a week before, we got caught in the lockdowns, and we had to make a decision about whether to run the workshops or try to invent something new. And in this video, I'm showing a solution that we created using Miro. It's a digital whiteboard application. It's free to use, and Zoom. And we got around 40 stakeholders together in breakout rooms. And what you're seeing in the video is us building, not us, but them building together the mental model of the problem. And we had different breakout rooms, and we grouped people by discipline or by government agency. So then we could compare the mental models of different groups. But that's stakeholders moving, creating boxes, arrows, connecting things. So it's a really amazing exercise. I don't think we could have done this physically if we would have done it the traditional way. I'm happy to, if anyone's interested in the setup to do that, I'm happy to, if you want to follow up on that, I'm happy to share that with you. So a bit of agent-based modeling. You can turn these mental maps into sort of these artificial society models where you have some agents in a landscape communicating with each other and following some rules, and in a way that it's very I wouldn't say easy, but you can capture complex people doing this. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but there's methodologies and there's pathways to translate the mental models, the fuzzy quantity maps, to an agent-based model. So just trust me on that. Again, this is work in progress, and there's different ways to do it, but believe me that it's possible. For those that are not familiar with agent-based modeling, I usually show this slide to explain it in a nutshell. Say you have a system, a flock of birds. It could be farmers competing for water and deciding to cooperate. Approach the idea of a system with an open mind. With ABMs or agent-based models, you can sort of think about the rules that lead to that behavior. You can build a simulation, run it in the computer, and see if that mimics the behavior that you either are seeing or that you want. And then you can sort of iterate with the rules and sort of have this virtual laboratory to test policies on your system. So I mentioned the iceberg. Coming back to the iceberg, agent-based models allow you to capture things that are at the bottom of the iceberg. Because you elicited the mental models in the FCM, then you're able to translate to a simulation. You are in one way or another sort of starting to see what's under the iceberg and finding ways or exploring ways to really transform the system, bring some clarity. This is how an ABM looks like in a groundwater context. So you have agents here, the dots, and you can have different types of agents. It could be farmers, mining bores, drinking water bores. Agents could be grouped in a water use association. And so you have these hierarchies, and at the top you have a regulator, and that agent, the regulator agent, could be worried about an impact in the system, and it will make some directives or decisions that will trickle down. And with ABM, you can sort of model this situation over time. To design these models, you need to ask yourself a number of questions. Think about first who the agents are, and you can run some additional workshops and figure out things like the questions that are, like the ones I have here, decisions that might occur as a group, right? There's water, like in Chile, we have water use associations. They make decisions as a group as well. So when I build a model that captures that, we need to elicit that as well. And you end up with, so you keep doing that with different stakeholders, and you build sort of this agent-based model that captures the horizontal interactions between stakeholders and the vertical interactions between those stakeholders and the hydrological. And you can have these macro agents that represent broader things. So agents don't have to be a farmer. It could be the economy, regulator. I think some of you might have seen this before. I presented this a couple of years ago at UWA, but just to give you a feel of what kind, the complexity, the simplicity and complexity of these models. This is an example we published in Nature Human Behavior, where we built an ABM to explore the the dynamics of illegal water use. Here we didn't do the participatory part. We took the behaviors from, instead of doing it from workshops, we did it from theory. And we conceptualized the problem. And this is a very general problem in environmental modeling, environmental science, when someone is policing a rule. It could be in a forest, a fishery, in an agricultural basin. Some limit the use of that natural resource, and there's some users, right? And can have different behaviors. They cooperate or extract the resource illegally, and other users can report or look those actions. There's some sort of enforcement and compliance dynamics, some monitoring, probably some fines. So I don't want to go too much into detail, but this is the kind of granularity that you can express with these agent-based simulations. And in this particular work, we were not only interested in the economic part, the social part was important as well. So we introduced some innovations there. So to bring some humanity. So again, I was mentioning the bottom of the iceberg, you have beliefs and values. So we wanted this model to capture some of that. So let me show you how you could do it. We use something called cultural theory. That is a theory that describes different types of people and social groups based on different beliefs, values, and there's kind of 4 categories. The ones here, you might have come across them. And we did some empirical work and we extracted statistics on these 2 dimensions that define whether in group, country, or society or community falls in. And we mapped out all the major countries in the world, this grid group map. And so then you get it. There are interesting correlations between countries. So you have your developed countries down here at the bottom and your sort of new independent countries that have been recently becoming independent. You have here, you have some religious sort of correlations, etc. And we use this to parameterize the agents. So we were interested in 4 groundwater hotspots: Darling Basin, the Central Valley in California, and the Punjab in the Pakistan border. So we use these parameters to parameterize the agents. And the agents are following some very simple rules. So imitation. So you copy, you look over the fence and you copy whoever's doing the best. And that's how strategies are made up of a probability of stealing water and a probability of reporting a neighbor that is breaching the. And this very simple construct allows you to sort of represent a social norm. So if you run this in time and you keep track of the mean sort of parameters over population parameters, this punitiveness and boldness, kind of a social norm, because you want people to be punitive, right? This number, you want it to be very high. This one, you want it to be low. You can track that in time. So you build this model, you have agents, and there's sort of some sort of interactions with neighbors. In this case, in groundwater, it's like fence behavior. You could explore other types of interactions. They're communicating through their environment, so they can be over pumping and they're affecting somebody else's performance as a farmer. And you kind of start seeing the emergent behaviors. So this is how one of these models looks like. You can build some like kind of dashboard, and you can set up the models in different ways. This is how we set them up for the different case studies. And it's like having a microscope, right? You can run tests on these samples of real system. And we did some validation in the Darling Basin case, and we had data on compliance. So we did a reality check. And unfortunately, these surveys haven't been done in other parts of the world, but at least we could say that the model behaves as we expect. Here's some of the outputs you can get. These heat maps show grid group dimensions of culture, and the different countries are plotted in these boxes. And what you see in colors is so after running the model for 25 years, what level of compliance do you get? So from 0 compliance to 100%, red to green. And you start seeing the complexity of the system emerge. You can see these tipping points, right? These very sharp bands where compliance changes abruptly. You can start testing how different interventions shift those compliance boundaries, and how in some cultures these boundaries are sharper. For example, in Pakistan and India, that's a lot sharper. So if you're able to push these systems past that tipping point, you should see widespread compliance, and there's cultural explanations for that. We tried other things like seeding rule followers, unconditional rule followers, people that always follow the rules. And that was the most powerful way for agents, tip our agents into compliance. This is some follow-up work that we did. And it's really interesting because, and I'm doing a project with the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. They're using this simulation to sort of polish their enforcement and compliance strategies. Here, for example, we can test it. Like the usual belief is that do you go out at random to catch the bad guys, or you do some targeted audits, right? It's believed that you should do it targeted, right? If you have a hotspot of farmers, so the red dots are farmers that are stealing water consistently, the blue ones are following the rules, the blue boxes are officers visiting them and issuing a fine. So you can see how you're sort of clustering all your enforcement resources in one part of the system, have outbreaks emerging in other parts. So it's a bit of like a COVID situation that we have here. On the other hand, when you go out at random with your limited enforcement resources, you contain the spread of this. Down here is the sort of the story of 100 agents. A white pixel is following the rules, black is breaching the rules, 100 agents, y-axis. And you can see how in different sort of cultures, now this is at a country level, it could be at a catchment level. We're doing work here in New South Wales where we're building these models at the catchment level. Different catchments have different sort of views of the world. They're more egalitarian, more individualist than others. So you can create these maps and sort of explore that. So this is 10 decades, the x-axis. If you deploy a certain strategy, what are the chances you'll get compliance or not? Interestingly, if you run some traditional models that look at equilibrium, you wouldn't have distinguished the trajectories. So these are illegal water extractions in volume per year. And the difference between the two lines is water you could have saved or you kept in the environment if you have done random monitoring instead of targeted. Integration with environmental models. So these ABMs in the Salar de Atacama project, we're using it to capture the regulatory space. They're not like, we don't have farmers in the system spread out geographically. So we're using ABMs more to capture this agents making decisions, different government agencies sharing information, resources, decisions, and those decisions affecting and being affected by the system. In the Salar de Atacama case, we're working with the Stockholm Environment Institute, and we're using a WEEP model as the biophysical simulator. And we're building some capabilities to attach ABMs to that. So if you're interested in that, happy to share some of that information. Finally, the management flight simulators. So imagine you board a flight from Perth to Sydney, and then over the speaker, this Captain John Travolta is saying, just finished my training, I read all the manuals, so sit back and enjoy the flight. It sounds like a funny scenario, but it's a bit of what happens like with decision makers, right? We do, or even us, we read all the books, we get our degrees, but we never sit in the cockpit, be confronted with real life situations. And I believe this is critical to solving most of the water sustainability issues that we're currently facing. We need to create models that people can play with and touch, and we can. So same like pilots, they put some really hard, put the pilots through some hard situations in a simulated environment. We should be doing the same with environmental issues. So this is this idea of a management flight simulator, where you can generate these trajectories, explore them in real time with stakeholders. This is precisely what we did in the Rappel Basin in central Chile and then the Copiapo Basin in northern Chile. And here's some snapshots of different versions of the models. And what we did there, we co-constructed the management flight simulator with stakeholders. We didn't just show up with this thing and the people were to use it. Everything we built into the simulator was proposed and agreed by stakeholders. We agreed on who are the agents, what are the goals of the agents, what the simulator should compute, show, strategies that they can deploy in the simulator, and even different governance scenarios that would lead to certain strategies being more suitable than others. We put a lot of effort in visualization, using spider plots and things that are very simple to read, pair variables of different sorts. Here's an example of the Copiapo Basin simulator. It's running a mode flow model in real time. So here there's some menus on the left and you can change model parameters and press run. And in about 2 minutes, get your simulations and it's deploying all sorts of outputs. That's remarkable because previously a hydrological modeling study take 3 years, right? It'll be 3 or 4 years since it was a consulting company would come, do the report, and you would have new scenarios. So here, now they can do it in real time and they can do it themselves. Here's a screenshot. During one of the workshops, one of the features of the simulator is people could raise their hand and one farmer could say, oh, what would be the impact in my farm? Another one could say, oh, what would be the impact in my farm? You could just click on the web interface and you could display those impacts right away. So here are sort of trajectories of groundwater depletion 30 years into the future. So we can have those open conversations in a workshop situation. Same with, there were some issues about how the level of filling in a dam and whether there was danger of overtopping. There have been some very ugly flash floods in recent decades. Those were triggered by topping of the dam. Yes, you want to fill the dam to have water security, but that increases flood risk. So the model could also show kind of outputs. And here are our stakeholders actually running the model. None of them are technical first in modeling, but they were able to operate the model, and like the model will give them these sort of user-friendly user reports, all sorts of outputs they could print out and have a discussion back in their agency. So again, these management flight simulators, to me, they inform, they engage. We debunked a lot of myths because we could run the scenarios there in real time. There were some myths like that if you lined the dam, you would prevent losses to the aquifer and you have more water security. But in the end, the way this aquifer works, the water is just going to be underground. There was like no benefit to lining the dam. So we debunked some myths and brought some clarity and created consensus. Finally, and very quickly, robust decision-making is a methodology that has been championed by the RAND Corporation. And it sort of turns modeling backwards in the sense that it starts from the basis that all the systems we're trying to improve have deep uncertainties. We're not sure how they work. Of course, we're not sure how to build accurate models or models that can represent them accurately. We cannot agree on what's important, and we cannot agree on the strategies. So it starts from a very humble position, and it's been applied in a number of areas. it's very simple in the way that you have to sort of bake your problem into this sort of XLRM framework. So if you can represent your model in this way, you have a simulation model that maps, it takes some actions, some levers, some uncertainties. It will spit out some performance metrics or things that people are concerned about to do robust decision making. You can pretty much fit any problem in. Here are some examples of projects that have applied the XLRM framework. So things they've represented. You could have very simple models here in the R component. It could even be an FCM. Some work doing robust decision making on mental models. That's kind of work in progress, but the message, you can have very simple models here. And just to quickly, so you know how this works. You sit down with your stakeholders and you define some outcomes of concern. So for example, these things are unacceptable. And we have 3 management options. Usually you have already some sort of strategies. You build your model or simulation system with LRM framework. And then you do what's called a vulnerability analysis. So you run your model for all the possible features, right, that could unfold. And you have this sort of heat maps. Here it's easy to see because you have 2 variables, right? Here there's 2 uncertainty, right? X1 and X2. It could be rainfall, temperature. So you run the model hundreds of thousands of times, millions of times to create these maps. You have an acceptable and unacceptable sort of criteria, so you can color this black or white. And you can do the same for all your different interventions. And then you can go back and sort of cycle through. So I call this the moonwalk. It's kind of Michael Jackson, doing it the Michael Jackson way, because you start from the basis that we're not running models into the future and then looking at the outputs and making some decisions. We acknowledge that the future is uncertain. And so we run the model for all the possible futures. And then we go back and see which strategies would be robust to all those possible futures. So robust in the sense that they would hold up against those futures. Things we've been doing with this framework. So I was saying lithium mining in the Atacama desert. We're also using it to support more engagement in environmental impact assessments of a gold mine extension. OBAR. We did some of this work with to understand the barriers and enablers of regen agriculture. Canberra. We're using it to study and explore different options for water markets using blockchain. And right now, this is an extension of that water theft ABM I was showing you just before. We're actually agencies, New South Wales Natural Resource Access Regulator wants to use this simulator to come with an optimal portfolio of strategies. So the bottom line, to me, the most important thing, and if you have to remember something of this talk, it's not about the tools, it's about the process. The most valuable thing you get out of this is the process. The tools are a means to going through this process. Sitting down, doing the mental model elicitation, building the management flight simulators, all those things are, and the act of doing it with the stakeholders is more important than the tool itself. The starting point, and going back to the iceberg analogy, the bottom part of the iceberg are mental models. If you want to transform your system, you got to go deep. So the first thing is to get together with your stakeholders, take some time, and develop these mental maps, quasi-cognitive maps. If you have the resources, the project demands it, if there's openness to it, build an agent-based simulation out of this, so it's taking it one step further, right? And of course, if there's biophysical model available, you can integrate it with it. Now it sounds sophisticated, but now with programming languages like Python, this is becoming far easier to do. Again, if anyone wants some ideas of how to do that, happy to discuss later. Management flight simulators, same like we train pilots to deal with complicated situations in a safe environment. I believe we need to put the effort to build these same kind of tools for water resource management. And finally, we need to acknowledge that all these tools, as sophisticated as they are imperfect. And the beauty about robust decision making, and now with the increase of computing capacity, we can run these hundreds of thousands of runs, right? And then use some very clever algorithms and some very interesting and engaging visualization tools to look at the trade-offs and sieve through all these huge library of runs to see where the vulnerabilities are, and identify those decisions that are, or strategies that are not optimal, but they can just, they're really strong against any possible future that could hold. So that's my presentation, and I'll leave the framework here, and I'm happy to take questions, and thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you very much, Juan. Well, that certainly was very interesting talk. Thank you very much. It was really nice to see how you've been trying to tame all this complexity, you know, that we always face as modelers. And yeah, it just seems that when you describe it this way, it seems very logical and ordered, which is really nice to see. So yeah, happy to take some questions from the floor. Just send out a little note there. Maybe if anyone's got questions I'd like to put to you, Juan, you can turn your mic off, turn your mic on and ask, or I'm happy to ask from the text. So Juan, maybe I could just start with one. So you showed the sort of flight management simulators, and I guess I was wondering, you know, you showed the interface and so on. Is that sort of an ongoing iterative sort of thing, like where you do this participation with the stakeholders, and then, you know, like it's an ongoing evolving process, or is it sort of a, you know, an initial point and then, you know, you go off and do your thing? Like quite often we struggle keeping continuity with these engagement processes, right?
Yeah. So I have a few tricks. So we go to the first workshop with a prototype. So the ones you see at the back are done in NetLogo. And the reason is because many people, it's the first time they are exposed to these kind of tools. So the first time you want to show the possibilities. So it kind of defies what the philosophy should be, to come in with an empty page. But I insist that when I show the prototype, and people get really excited because they start saying, oh, can you increase the rainfall? Can you add a well there? What happens if we build a desalination plant here? And people just go crazy. Then you end up, and yes, we had a number of instances. So for example, in the Copiapo project, each of these were a workshop. So we had a workshop to find what the agents are going to be, one for the goals, what are the outcomes of the concern, and how we're going to measure them. And that's one of in the photo there, one of those exercises. We do that over a actual map of the system, so we can just scribble, and so it's more engaging. So yeah, it should be iterative. And yeah, and usually go through a process like this takes about 18 months. So it takes time if you want to do it properly. ideally, you don't want it to be a one-off thing. And that's kind of a dream I have, is to be able to embed this and with the Atacama project is probably going to happen because the Chilean government identified 100 basins that need to be undergo this thorough modeling. And this was number one, the most critical one. So this will be a part of blueprint of how you should be doing modeling in all the basins. So I hope that after this one, it will be replicated in all the other 99. So,
so I guess one of the reasons I asked that question as well was around the role of trust in the models. So quite often people, they see these things and they love them because they, as you say, they can put in this feature and test that scenario. But then, you know, some of these models get pretty complicated. So how do we build trust that the complex models, and especially some of the ones you've shown, are super complicated in terms of their complex dynamics? So how do you build that trust that they you know, can trust the decisions? And I guess that means there's a process whereby people need to come back to the process later on.
Yeah, well, there's two things. First, you need to clarify to your client or stakeholder that we're not competing to biophysical models. This is kind of a separate path, and that usually eases their concerns and builds some trust, because we're not aiming to predict. We're aiming to identify trends, and once you put humans into the equation and you start simulating human behavior, like that uncertainty clouds everything else. So you need to upfront explain what the objective is, exploring system behavior, not predicting outcomes accurately. And I had a situation last week. We were showing the prototype to the stakeholders in the Atacama. And yeah, because you want to start simple, right? And they wanted, oh, but that behavior is not like that. Can you add more realism? And they wanted realism. And so it takes, I guess, to build trust, to answer your question, you need to be a good facilitator. You need to, it takes a lot of soft skills.
Yeah.
And like you need to be a very balanced modeler. So not just technically, but also have some soft skills and know what the limitations of this framework is.
So we've got a few other questions coming in. Ben White there saying, what is the role of leadership amongst agents? Can you account for, I guess the question is around how do you account for that in that agent-based approach?
Leadership, okay. I assume that's in the simulation. So we did that in the Groundwater Commons game, and we had a few scenarios where we simulated leadership. There. So we were interested in leadership, and what we did is we fixed, instead of agents imitating each other, we were seating a fraction of agents that always follow the rules. So we wanted to understand if by engaging unconditional rule followers or leaders, we could get the whole system into compliance or cooperation. And we found that you only need about 20 to 30% of leaders in your system to tip the whole system into compliance. So it's kind of the 80-20 rule emerging right there in front of us. And it made us think, instead of in the Murray-Darling Basin, instead of investing in all this infrastructure and all these billions of dollars, maybe if you invest in education and engaging that 30% of leaders in the community, whether that could have a far greater impact than other measures that have been taken. So yeah, so agent-based modeling is flexible enough so you can have a theory of how leadership works, and you could write a model that sort of follows that.
Great, thanks. A couple more questions coming through. Greg Ryan here just saying, could we use it here in WA to investigate response to climate change in groundwater instead of just using biophysical models alone?
Tough question. Yeah, I mean, you have prams over there, right? And you could go through a process like this and build all the simulation engine on top, right? And focus. The interest in the Atacama is, and it's not easy, managing this web of interconnections between agencies, right? And how decisions flow through that web. It's not easy. So we're developing this, actually a work in progress. We're trying to find ways to capture those kind of drive. At the end of the day, those are the main drivers of the system. And you kind of have two levels. You have the agents that affect the system, like, so they're pumping or they're injecting water or recharging the aquifer. We call those first level agents. You have a second level of agents that are one level removed, that are on top of them. They're not interacting directly with the system. And those are your government agencies. And even in the Atacama Desert, we have a third level that is the global demand for lithium. So you can telecouple this, your local system, say in Perth or anywhere, to all the way up to the global level if you want to take it that far.
Great. Yep. Another question here from Brad Deegans. I think it's Brad Deegans, Brad D. How difficult has it been to engage people in the participatory process? Is it the promise of influence in decision making? Is the promise of influence in decision making the main attraction, or the transparency in decision making?
So I've come across two situations. In Copiapo, we went in after, and Don McFarlane would know this, even Cyril was there, and we came after 20 years of the typical one-way consulting. This is how you do things. And people, actually in the first workshop I ran, somebody stood up and he started like, these guys are spending our money and they're wasting our time. So they try to boycott the situation. After I gave a very similar talk to this, they were nodding their heads and actually saying, sorry, like, this is really what we've been looking for a long time, to be heard, to understand what's going on, to be part of it. So that's one situation I've experienced where people are tired of business as usual and they're hungry for these kinds of approaches. And the other one, and this is in the Salar de Atacama project, where your government agency can be very reluctant to opening the black box and having such an open conversation where people can play with the model and see the impact that a mining company can do. And it's just really, for some agencies, it's really invasive. So, so that's the two situations I've encountered.
Yeah, great. And sort of related, Don's put up a question as well around sort of people can question consultation if it doesn't come up with their preconceived idea of how it should work. So he said, does the Ikea method overcome this problem with consultation?
Yeah. So the beauty of this is that if somebody has another, there's two main ideas, right? Competing. We don't discard any of the two. We build it into the model. And in the simulation, you can just have a switch, right? And you can switch between the two ideas, or the two, even you could have two competing groundwater models, for example. And you could have a switch, so select model 1 or model 2 and run the same scenarios with different models. And now you can do this on the fly. I mean, with Python and all these amazing libraries, you can do this with very little resources. So this is about challenging preconceived ideas, testing them against each other. And we have a duty of being a honest broker in this, so not take parts. Again, I come back to the soft skills, and that's, I think, to me, it's the most important part.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Juan. We'll let you go and the others go. We've gone a bit over our hour. But yeah, really appreciate the comprehensive talk. It looks very exciting, the work you're doing, and yeah, we'd love to stay in touch and hear how it develops.
Thanks, Matt. And same here. If any of this resonates with you, please let me know. I'm very much interested to set my eyes again in Western Australia.
Fantastic. Well, great. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for logging in. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.